Okay, so a couple notes before we get started. Tonight we're starting 2 Samuel or 2 Kingdoms, depending on your translation. Now, this book is where calling it 2 Samuel becomes kind of weird, because as you may have noticed, as we went through 1 Samuel, Samuel died about 3/4 of the way through 1 Samuel, and he does not appear in 2 Samuel. And so it's also pretty certain that he didn't write 2 Samuel. Okay. The thinking, I guess, behind identifying these two books as 1 and 2 Samuel is, well, first of all, they go together, clearly. And second of all, they belong to the part of what we call the Old Testament that the Jews, even in Christ's time, referred to as the prophets. Right? They talk about the law and then the prophets. Okay? And the main prophet in this period of time was Samuel. Right? Was Samuel. So even though the first book is sort of half about Samuel and half about Saul, and then the second book we're going to see is pretty much all about David, they were identified with a prophet that way. 1 and 2 Kings are pretty obviously about the succession of kings. Okay. So, but when they were translated into Greek, you can understand why they just grouped all four of them together, because it's a continuous story. It said 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th kingdoms. These are the stories about the kings. Right. So, but that's the reasoning behind it being 2 Samuel, even though, again, it's pretty obvious contextually that he didn't write it being dead. Right. I had a question last time after we were done. I covered a lot last time because we were kind of close to the end and I wanted to sort of finish out the story. And so I didn't have a lot of time for questions 2 weeks ago. But I had a question after we were done about, really the question was about the editing of that chunk of 1 Samuel. Because I was pointing out how it's kind of, some of it was kind of awkward. You know, you have this episode where David spares Saul's life, where he could have killed him, but he didn't. And so Saul sort of says, oh, okay, I'll stop chasing you. And then all of a sudden, he's chasing him again. Right? And then a couple chapters later, he spares his life again. And so there's sort of this awkward construction, right, going on there. Well, the thing you have to remember is that these books weren't written, well, they especially weren't written as a diary, like at the time they were happening. Right? It wasn't written, you know, it was as these things happened, somebody recorded, you know, okay, today David did this, and then Saul did this, and then, these are stories, these are things that happened that were then stories about David, stories about Saul that were then collected. They were then collected and put together. And we saw how the Hebrew manuscripts that were used for like the King James Version, remember there was that one place where there was almost a whole chapter extra in the King James Version? There's like a whole extra story. That's because the Hebrew text that was from was one collection of stories, and the Hebrew text that was translated into Greek was a set of stories that was missing one of those stories. Okay? So these are stories that are compiled afterwards. Okay? So at some point, likely soon after David's reign, these things were compiled together. Usually people think it was in the 900s and the 10th century, whereas these things are happening in the 11th century, in the 1000s. Right? These stories were all put together. And so all the stories about the time where David was sort of on the run, right, with his band of mercenaries with Saul, those were put together and edited together. But it wasn't just sat down and composed, right, like one long story. And there are some books that are like that. Like we saw Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is basically one long address from Moses, so it's sort of one long thing. And we especially see that in the New Testament in the epistles, right? The epistles are a letter from mostly St. Paul or one of the other apostles to a church somewhere. So it's one letter, it's one piece. It was sort of written all together at one time. But these books, like we talked about a little bit with the Pentateuch, these came together over time and took the form that we have them in now relatively later. So that's why sometimes you'll see things where you're like, well, that story just seems kind of stuck in there, right? And sometimes it's because that story is just kind of stuck in there, right? There's a story and it's there. Okay. Now that brings me to the second point I wanted to make about this. I don't know if anybody here has ever seen the television show Battles BC. It's on the History Channel a lot. Does anybody see that? There's this show gives a really great example of something directly related to what we've been reading. On this show, they did an episode about David and Saul and these battles that we've been reading about in 1 Samuel. And in it, one of their experts comes on and rather confidently says that all this stuff about David sparing Saul's life and all these stories we read were all made up. And that what really happened is that David assassinated Saul, and then they made up all these stories to cover it up after David became king. Okay? Now, you remember back when we first started 1 Samuel, and I was talking about David, and I said the only historical, archaeological evidence we have that he ever existed was one inscription. They called Israel the House of David. Right? So on the one extreme, we have the people who still claim he didn't exist. Right? Now on the other side, we have people who not only are confident that he existed, they're confident they can tell you what really happened. Right? And then all of this is a lie. Okay? But this is a good example of something, because unfortunately, the way that expert is reading the Bible is the way a lot of experts read the Bible now. Okay? It's sometimes called the hermeneutic of suspicion. Hermeneutic means interpretation, or your way of interpreting something. We take for granted, and it used to be the case, that when people took, say, the Bible to interpret it, they said, what was the person who wrote this? Right? Whether they believed God was behind it and God was trying to tell them something, or whether they believed just a human wrote it and the human was trying to tell us something. You tried to figure out, what are they trying to tell me? Right? And we kind of take it for granted that that's how you read things, right? that when we read something that someone wrote, they're trying to communicate something to us, and we're trying to figure out what the author wanted us to take away from it. Okay? That's not how they do it anymore. Since the 1960s. There's an assumption that nothing is objective, right? Nothing you read is objective. So this isn't an objective account of what happened. And that much we can kind of agree with. There is a perspective here on what happened, right? But that everyone who writes anything is writing it in order not to communicate something, but in order to argue something, in order to convince you of something, right? In order to make you believe something. So when you read something now, these experts will read it and they will say, okay, what is this person trying to get me to believe? And then they think, well, why would it be to that person's advantage to make me believe X instead of Y? Right? What are they trying to pull off here? Okay? So that's how he's reading this text. He's going, why are there all these things about how David could have killed Saul but didn't? I bet he really killed him. And he's trying to cover it up, right? And there are all different forms of this. There are feminist forms of this. There's an article in the Journal of Biblical Literature that's become kind of infamous, where a woman went and read the book of Ezekiel from the witch's point of view. There's a big chunk of it where he's condemning these witches for witchcraft.
Oh yeah, so that definitely.
And so they went and they said, oh, these witches, they must have had some kind of spiritual power and authority in Israel, and Ezekiel's trying to put him down. So they go in and they construct this whole alternate reality, sort of behind what you're reading. Now the reason I bring that up is because if you watch documentaries, like on the History Channel, you'll see people reading the Bible this way. Right? Like the guy on Battles BC, who just take for granted that's how you read things. Okay? we obviously as Christians can't read Scripture that way. Because for us, these particular stories are here and have made it down through all these centuries because God wants to communicate something to us through them. Okay, and so when we read them, that has to be our goal. But we have to be aware that most of the people now who are going to be, you're going to be seeing on TV and in the media and in articles and National Geographic and all these things, aren't coming at it from that perspective at all. They're coming at it with all kinds of assumptions. Okay? See, what's interesting is the way they try to read the Bible actually applies to the way they write. Yeah. Right? Like the feminist author who wrote about the book of Ezekiel, right? She's trying to do something. She's not trying to communicate what Ezekiel communicated. She's trying to do something. She has her own agenda. Right? So she acts like Ezekiel writes the way she does. The reality is Ezekiel's doing something totally different. So that's sort of a cautionary thing. Anytime you see someone talking about the Scriptures and they start asking questions or making statements like, what really probably happened, that's a warning sign. That's a warning sign. Because if something other than this really happened, it's irrelevant. Because this is what God wanted us to know. This is God's perspective on it. You know? Whatever else may have happened in Saul's life, these are the events in Saul's life that God wanted us to know about today, in 2012. Right? So that's what's important. Anything really happened that constructed what he looked like, you know, any of these things might be interesting. A way to waste an afternoon watching History Channel, and I do like watching History Channel. But they're not the core of what's going on with the Scriptures. Okay. So does anybody have any questions about that before we get started on 2 Samuel? Okay, because this is going to come up right away. This whole idea that there's some kind of conspiracy behind this, right? Because we're going to see. Remember, the Philistines had attacked Saul and they killed Saul and Jonathan, and David was with the Philistines at that time. But we were told that he had been called back because somebody had raided his village. Our friends on Battle BC goes, "Oh yeah, sure he got called back to his village. Sure he wasn't there, right?" But we're going to see that's not where this goes. Okay. So 2 Samuel 1 verse 1. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag for 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and with dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." He said, "The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear, with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood over him and killed him because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord." So we get a little more detail about Saul's death. We already heard he committed suicide. Okay? Well, now apparently when he impaled himself, he didn't die as quickly as he might have liked. Okay? So he asks this man who was in the camp, as a passersby, to come and finish it, because he was in pain as he was dying. The other interesting thing is that this man is an Amalekite. Remember where the Amalekites occurred before with Saul? They're the ones who God told him to go and wipe out, and he didn't. And so now it's an Amalekite who ends up finishing Saul off at the end of this. Sort of emblematic of his disobedience. The fact that he hadn't obeyed God. But now apparently at least it was known by this Amalekite and by some of the other soldiers that David had been anointed king, because when he gets Saul's crown and his armband, that he brings them to David, because the idea is now David's going to be the king. So what's David's response? How did Saul respond to these kind of things? Throw a party? Right?
Brag about it.
Yeah, brag about it, throw a party, build a monument to himself, right? His great achievement and his enemy being defeated. Now here's how David responds in verse 11. Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Okay. So not only does he not gloat, not only does he not celebrate, and it's not just Jonathan, his friend. I mean, we would understand that. Jonathan was his friend and his friend died. But it's over Saul as well. This person who's just spent several years trying to murder him. And he mourns over what happened to him. Now again, I've made this point before, but you get these people who talk about the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God is mean and angry and blah, blah, blah. And in the New Testament, he's nice and loving. Well, here's David loving his enemy. Right? David, the man after God's own heart, loving his enemy here in the Old Testament. Okay, again, this isn't a new thing in the New Testament. This goes all the way back. It's the same God. Okay. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why were you not afraid to lift your hand and destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go, strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Well, that seems kind of harsh. Right? But remember what David said when he spared Saul's life. Right? If anybody had a justification to kill Saul, it was David. Right? I mean, self-defense. He's out to kill him. He said, "I'm not going to kill the Lord's anointed. I'm not going to kill a Christian. I'm not going to kill this other human being. I'm not going to kill him." Okay? And so even though Saul asked him to kill him, right, as Saul was killing himself, right, David sees there's you can't take another person's life, right? Especially not one of God's anointed people. Okay, regardless of how Saul lived his life, regardless of what he did, right? This isn't right. And so this man is put to death. Remember back in Genesis, right? He who spilleth a man blood, so shall his blood be spilled by a man. Verse 17, David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, in order that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. We do not have the book of Jashar, but that was apparently a book of hymns at the time. Now we know, and we're going to read later, many of the Psalms in the Old Testament were written by David. This is the first example we have of a hymn that David wrote. And this is a hymn or a poem that was written about this event. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights, how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. O mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, the sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. Okay? And this is where the phrase, how the mighty have fallen, comes from. It comes from this hymn that David wrote. But notice again, it's not just about Jonathan. It's about Saul too. It's about Saul too. Again, what we're being taught here, the way Samuel, the way David look at Saul, we're being taught here how we ought to look at our enemies, or the people who we consider our enemies. Because trust me, a guy trying to murder you is about as enemy as you can get, okay? Neither of them make slanderous accusations against Saul. Neither of them set out to destroy Saul. Neither of them try to get revenge on Saul. Right? They mourn for Saul. They weep for Saul. They wish desperately that Saul would turn from the direction he's going and be saved. Right? That's hard for us to do. When somebody cuts me off in traffic, I don't immediately yearn for that man's salvation. Right? I tell him he could go someplace else, right? Okay, and when somebody at work or at school in my past was I thought out to get me or just ruining my life, making my life more difficult for no apparent reason, right? I didn't sit and weep for them and how mired in sin they were, right? I didn't do that either, okay? But that's the example we're being shown. That's the example we're being shown here. And it's not different from when Jesus is standing about to enter Jerusalem and he looks at the city full of the people who are about to demand that he be murdered, right? We're about to demand his crucifixion, right? And weep over it and say, how I long to gather you together like a hen gathers her chicks, but you wouldn't have it, right? This is God's perspective on the wicked. It's God's perspective on the wicked. He doesn't want to throw lightning bolts and wipe them out. He doesn't want to send them to hell and punish them for eternity. That's not what God's about. Okay? It's not what God's about. God loves them. He wants them to turn from their evil ways and live. But some of them won't have that. Some of us won't do that. Okay? And so David, being a man after God's own heart, this is what it means, that his attitude and his love mirrors how God feels about these people. It's chapter 2, verse 1. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went up there with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. When David was told that it was the men of Jabesh-Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." So he spends this period of time mourning for Saul and Jonathan, and then he asks God, "Is it time for me now to go and be king?" And so he goes to Hebron, and remember, Hebron is the city that Caleb went and took. I would just say these associations are significant. Remember how we saw with Saul, he's from the tribe of Benjamin, and it was all these, he was spending time in all these places that were sort of negative in their previous history. David's going to Hebron, which is where Caleb made his sort of heroic stand as an elderly man, saying he was going to conquer the toughest city they could find in Judah. So he's made king, and he sends this message thanking the men who had gone and gotten the bodies of Saul and Jonathan and had taken them and buried them. And from this point forward, in Jewish tradition, burying the bodies of the dead was seen as one of the greatest good works of holiness that you could do. Because somebody's body being left out to rot was sort of the ultimate sign that they were a curse, that they were unloved, they had no family, there was no one to care for them. The body was just tossed aside like garbage. And so someone who came and took care of a body like that and buried it was considered to be to have done a great good deed in Jewish tradition. And that carries through to St. Joseph of Arimathea with Christ. After he's crucified, he was crucified naked, and in most cases, victims of crucifixion, since they were condemned criminals, their bodies were taken down off the crosses and thrown in a ditch. That's usually what happened to people who were crucified. Okay, so St. Joseph of Arimathea going out, taking possession of this body of this convicted criminal publicly, in addition to the public humiliation of associating himself with that kind of person, him doing that is why he's St. Joseph of Arimathea. It was a major good work. Okay. So verse 8, meanwhile Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Okay. So David has gone back to Hebron, which is sort of the main city in his tribe of Judah, and they've pronounced him king, recognizing that Samuel had anointed him king. But Abner, who we've seen before, who was one of Saul's military commanders, has latched on to one of Saul's surviving sons and has now declared him king of pretty much all the other tribes of Israel except Judah. Okay? So the idea here is that Abner is getting ready for a civil war here. Right? He's got his candidate who he wants on the throne, and it's not David. Okay. Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool and one group on the other side. Okay? So we have Abner, who was Saul's general, who's now propped up Saul's son as his candidate for king. We have Joab, who we're going to see going forward, is going to be one of David's main generals. Okay? So Joab, who's one of David's main generals, has come out, and they're having a sit down. Okay? Joab's there representing David. Abner's there representing Ishbosheth. Okay. And then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right, let them do it," Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side. And they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkat Hazurim, which means like the field of daggers, the field of knives. Okay. The battle that day was fierce, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by David's men. So the idea here is that while they're sitting there chatting, right, Abner says, "Hey, how about we have some of our men do a little combat exhibition, right? Do a little hand-to-hand fight, a little boxing, right? And we'll watch." So Joab says, "Okay." And so they pair off. And then as soon as they start this boxing for entertainment, Abner's guys pull out knives and kill David's men. Okay, so ambush them. So this breaks out then into a big battle, big fight. David's men end up winning. Okay. The three sons of Zeruiah were there: Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle, so he's a good runner. He chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he answered. So he's chasing. The fight's gone bad for Abner. Asahel's chasing him down. Okay, and so Abner yells back to him, "Is that you?" "It is," he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or to the left. Take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. So he says, why don't you go after one of my guys? You can have his stuff. Right? It's basically what that says. Go after one of those young guys so that he could get away. Right? Again, Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" So now it gets a little more threatening. Right? Now he says, "Stop chasing me, because if you keep chasing me, I'm going to have to turn around, I'm going to have to kill you, and that'll make it real rough next time I try to have a sit down with Joab, as if it's going to be easy after this stunt he just pulled anyway." But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit. So Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell there and died on the spot. And every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. Okay? So Abner spins around, kills him, right? And the men who are chasing then come up and see this spot, see that he's dead there, and they stop. They stop chasing. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. Okay, so his two brothers, they're not right now. They're going to get Abner. And as the sun was setting, they came to the hill of Ammah near Giah, on the way to the wasteland of Gibeon. Then the men of Benjamin rallied behind Abner. They formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. Okay, so they chase Abner. Abner realizes he's lost most of the opposing troops. So he tells his guys to stop, right? The rest of his guys who are retreating. And they turn around and sort of form up in formation on top of this hill. Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their brothers?" Okay. So Abner now says, why does there have to be all this bloodshed? Mr. Bloodshed, right? The guy who did the ambush, the guy who just killed their brother says, we don't need any more killing today. So apparently he thinks he's done enough. Joab answered, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued the pursuit of their brothers until morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men came to a halt. They no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight anymore. All that night Abner and his men marched through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, continued through the whole Bithron, and came to Mahanaim. Then Joab returned from pursuing Abner and assembled all his men. Besides Asahel, 19 of David's men were found missing. But David's men had killed 360 Benjamites who were with Abner. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron by daybreak. Okay, so Joab decides not to try and assault the Benjamites' position. They go across the Jordan and go their way. He comes back. David lost 20 men. Abner lost 360 men. Okay, that's good for David, but remember, David right now is king of one tribe, and Abner, through Ishbosheth, is controlling most of the other tribes, but particularly Benjamin and Ephraim. Chapter 3, verse 1, the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. Now let's pause a second. Here's wife number 3. Right? And who's this wife? This wife is the daughter of a non-Jewish king. Right? Of a Canaanite king. Okay. Now remember back in Deuteronomy, what was the first thing God said? When you have a king, don't let him do. Multiply his wives. Okay? Well, they're multiplying. We've just hit 3, technically 4 if you count Michal, Saul's daughter, remember, who he married first. But she's been married off to somebody else at this point. So this is the third wife. Now, this was very common in the early Iron Age at this time. It was very common that the way treaties were made between countries is that one of the daughters of the one king would become part of the harem, essentially, of the other king. Okay? The idea being that if one of your wives is my daughter, okay, and you have kids with her, those kids are my grandkids, and you're less likely to attack grandpa, right, than you are some stranger, right? And grandpa is less likely to attack son-in-law, right, than some stranger. So this was the idea, okay? Now we're going to see, particularly with David's son, that this gets out of control, okay? But right now we're seeing already with David. Remember, what was one of the big things that separated him from Saul? Look at the episode with Goliath. He trusted in God, right, to bring him victory. Whereas Saul was trying to cut all these deals and work out all these strategies and do all this manipulation. Well, now David is starting to make treaties with the Canaanites, right, by marrying their daughters. Okay, he's starting to behave more like the kings around him, the kings that Samuel warned them about, and less like the shepherd boy we first met, right? There's a change happening here. Okay, so Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. Who's that? It's 4. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. There's 5. And the 6th, Ithream, the son of David's wife, Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. Okay, so he's got all these different sons by all these different women. Okay, who are his wives. Okay, see the shift happening here. During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. Okay. So Abner, remember, he started out propping up Ishbosheth as his king, but now he's trying to sort of secure his own place, right, in the hierarchy there. Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Okay. So Abner says, "I'm going to go and sleep with now dead King Saul's concubine, probably hoping to have a child with her, right? And that child with her would be somewhere in line, at least for the throne, would be the idea." Okay. Abner was very angry because of what Ishbosheth said and answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David, yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman." Okay, so he's indignant. Right? He says, "Hey, I'm the one who put you here, right? I could have just handed you over to David when your father died and sided with him, and that would have been it. Right? How dare you come to me accusing me of something?" May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. Ishbosheth did not dare to say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. Okay? So Abner says, you mess with me, buddy, and I'm going to switch sides. I'm going to go help David. Remember, Dan was all the way up there, up at the top. Beersheba's all the way down at the bottom. He's like, I'll make sure he's king of the whole thing and leaves you nothing. Verse 12, then Abner sent messages on his behalf to say to David, whose land is it? Make an agreement with me and I will help you bring all Israel over to you. So he sends a messenger to David. He's so angry. He sends a messenger over to David and says, let's talk. Let's talk. Maybe I can help you. Verse 13, good, said David, I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me. Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, demanding, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins. Remember, that was his original wife. Was Saul's daughter, and when Saul got mad at David and decided he wanted him dead, he went and married her to somebody else. Okay? Well, so now David, kind of a power play, right, is saying to Michal's brother, hey, I want my original wife back right now. And he sent Abner this message saying, okay, Abner, you want to come over to my side? Bring my wife with you. So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband Paltiel, son of Laish. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go back home, so he went back. Okay, so this poor guy is having his wife taken, right? Yeah, well, yeah. But, apparently he loved her because, he's in tears, he's weeping, he's following her. No, please come back. Abner sees him, tells him to go home. The poor guy lopes back home, right? Now, here's an interesting thing, though. Why does David want her back? He's got, what, 7 other wives. He isn't needing for wives, right? She's the daughter of Saul. She's the daughter of Saul, which makes him the son-in-law of Saul, the dead king. Okay? So there's something going on here that's foreshadowing something that's going to happen later. Where David doesn't really care about this Paltiel guy. Right? How he feels about his wife, he wants this wife back. Right? Because of the power it gives him in this. This is foreshadowing something he's going to do later. Okay, that we'll see. But again, you're seeing the change in him. Again, too, and how he's thinking. Right? He never tried to get her back before this. Right? So verse 17, Abner conferred with the elders of Israel and said, for some time you have wanted to make David your king. Now do it, for the Lord promised David, by my servant David I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies. Okay, so he goes, these elders, remember, these are the people who are in charge of the various towns. Right, the upstanding men. Abner's kind of gotten them together and says, hey, I know a lot of you like David, right? If we want to make him king, if you want to all announce him king, forget that Ishbosheth guy. Now's the time, let's do it. Let's do it. Abner also spoke to the Benjamites in person. Okay, so he goes to Ishbosheth's own tribe and talks to them. Then he went to Hebron to tell David everything that Israel and the whole house of Benjamin wanted to do. When Abner, who had 20 men with him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and his men. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a compact with you, and that you may rule over all that your heart desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Okay. So Abner is doing all this backroom dealing, right, with all these guys. He comes back, he tells David, "Hey, we got this locked up. Right, I've been doing some politicking for you." He says, "Let me go and we'll finalize this." So he leaves. In verse 22, just then David's men and Joab returned from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, because David had sent him away and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, he was told that Abner, son of Ner, had come to the king, and that the king had sent him away, and that he had gone in peace. So Joab comes back and finds out that the guy who ambushed him, the guy who killed his brother, has now switched sides, and now he and David are friends, apparently. How do you imagine he might react to this turn of events? So Joab went to the king and said, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone. You know Abner, son of Ner. He came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you are doing." Right? So he's saying, you had him right here. Right? You should have arrested him. You should have arrested him. You know he's slippery. Right? You know what he's like. He's betraying Ishbosheth at least. Right? He's saying, why'd you let him go? Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner. And they brought him back from the well of Sirah, but David did not know it. Now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the gateway, as though to speak with him privately. And there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. So Joab sends some men after him to bring him back. Abner comes back. Joab says, "Hey, come here, let me tell you something." Stabs him. Stabs him, kills him. Okay? To get revenge for his brother. Later, when David heard about this, he said, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house. May Joab's house never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food." That's a pretty mean. That's a pretty mean curse. You know? May your family be stricken with disease and handicaps and violence and all these things. Okay. And then in verse 30, Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle at Gibeon. Then David said to Joab and all the people with him, "Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and walk in mourning in front of Abner." King David himself walked behind the bier, the tomb. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb. All the people wept also. Okay? So again, David's response, Abner, enemy turned sort of friend, maybe. Right? But whatever Abner's faults, right, you don't kill him in the street. Okay? And he tries to tell Joab and his brother, right, even if this guy is your enemy and he killed your brother, correct response, not to murder him. You should mourn. You should mourn him. And the king sang this lament for Abner. "Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before wicked men." And all the people wept over him again. Then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day, but David took an oath, saying, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets." All the people took note and were pleased. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So on that day all the people in all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. Then the king said to his men, "Do you not realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak. And these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." So, there's been a shift in David's character, but at least he still is rejecting this kind of violence, right, in terms of his own power. Okay, he's not willing to shed blood. He's not willing to assassinate. He's not willing to, right, kill his political enemies. When Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Okay, because again, remember, Abner was sort of propping him up, right? Abner, the military commander, was really the guy. Now Saul's son had two men who were leaders of raiding bands. One was named Baanah and the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon the Beerothite from the tribe of Benjamin. Beerot is considered part of Benjamin, because the people of Beerot fled to Gittaim and have lived there as aliens to this day. Okay, so they're basically saying, this guy's a foreigner, but he's considered to be part of the tribe of Benjamin because all the people from his line live in Benjamin. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled. His name was Mephibosheth. Now, Mephibosheth is a great biblical name if you're trying to think of one for a new baby. He'll be the only Mephibosheth at his school, so he won't get called Mephibosheth D, or, because there's another Mephibosheth. Okay, so this Mephibosheth, right, is Jonathan's son. And what it's basically saying here is that as a baby, when the word got out that Saul and Jonathan had died, right, chaos broke out. Nurse tried to flee with him, apparently dropped him, and both of his legs were injured. And being at that time, medical science was not great. They didn't heal correctly. So Mephibosheth can't walk to this day because the bones in his legs didn't heal correctly. Okay. Now Rechab and Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, set out for the house of Ishbosheth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Baanah slipped away. Okay, so Ishbosheth has these two guys working for him who are leading raiding bands, meaning they're sort of bandits. Right? They're raiding people on the road. They're raiding caravans on the roads and stealing things to enrich him. While Abner, who was the military guy, who was the real brains and the real muscle behind the whole operation, is gone. So they decide to take out Ishbosheth, and they assassinate him. Most likely to try to take over in his place. Okay. They had gone into the house while he was lying on the bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head. Taking it with them, they traveled all night by way of the Arabah. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to take your life. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." Okay? So they go and bring the head to David and say, "Look, we killed your enemy. Reward us now." David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of all trouble, when a man told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and I put him to death at Ziklag." Right? He says, maybe you haven't heard. Right? But the guy who came and told me he killed Saul, I had him put to death. Right? That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed? Should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you? So David gave an order to his men, and they killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. Okay, so he takes the head and he tries to give it, as close to a burial as you can. Right, with Abner. Okay. And the idea here is that he made a public example of these two. Right? Saying this is not acceptable. This is not how we deal with. Now this is gruesome, obviously. This is how dynastic succession happened, though, in the early Iron Age at this time. The way you typically became king is you killed the previous king. Usually starting with killing the previous king and then wiping out his whole family so that none of them would rise up to take the throne. This was not at all uncommon. Okay, this is how the kings, the kings of the other nations that the Israelites wanted a king like, this is how they behave. Okay, this is how they behave. David, at least at this point, is not going there. Okay, he is not going to participate in assassination and murder. So chapter 5, verse 1, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.' When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king and reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. Okay, so now he's officially recognized as the king of all the tribes. He's 30 years old at this point, which was advanced age at this point in history. Okay, but he's going to reign another 40 years. Okay, so he's going to end up dying at 70. Okay, which is fairly early. And a 40-year reign as king is extremely long by the standards of this time. Extremely long time. Okay. Now it's also interesting to note that Christ was 30 years old when he was baptized by St. John in the Jordan River and began his public ministry in Israel. So in verse 6, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. Jerusalem, as much as we associate it with Israel, they hadn't captured it yet, remember? They left it because it was too fortified back in Joshua. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." Okay, so they're talking a little bit of trash at David. They're like, "We can get a whole bunch of handicapped people up here. They can keep you from taking our city." Okay. They thought, David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of David, which is how it became known as the city of David. On that day, David said, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say the blind and the lame will not enter the palace." Okay, so there's this, especially with a big city at this time, relatively big, by their standards, they have to have a source of water. So there's this water tunnel, which is basically using gravity to flow water from a spring into the city. That's where the city gets their water. Okay? So David makes this joke, right? That if we're going to go in there and fight those blind and lame guys, the best way to go is going to be to go through this water tunnel. Right? Because if they block up the water tunnel, they're not going to have any water. Right? David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. He built up the area around it from the supporting terraces inward. And he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. Okay. So he takes the city by sneaking in through the water tunnel. Right? Captures it, makes it his capital. So now he's the king of the whole now nation of Israel. He's got his new big capital city. Right? Everything's great so far. Okay. He's got everything God promised him. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David. Remember, Tyre's on a little island. It's probably on the last map I gave you. It's a little island barely off the coast. It's a Phoenician city. It is at this point in history one of the Phoenicians' capitals. It's near Sidon. Sidon and Tyre were their two main shipping outposts at this point. And the Phoenicians had a trade empire on the Mediterranean. They were shipping goods. Okay, and it's all way up on the northern coast in the area of the Phoenicians on those maps. And Tyre was an extremely powerful city because they were out on this little island and they had walls all the way around the edge of the island in the city. And it was founded a couple of centuries before this and was never conquered by anyone until Alexander the Great conquered it in the 300s BC. So it's another 700 years after this before anybody can conquer Tyre. That's how powerful militarily the city was. It's also powerful financially in terms of shipping. So Hiram, king of Tyre, is a Phoenician, is a Canaanite, right? So he's a pagan, but he's an incredibly powerful neighboring ruler. So he sends messengers to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. And David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So David clearly has some kind of treaty. It's not just like Hiram, king of Tyre, went around building houses for people out of the kindness of his heart. Right? David has some kind of treaty that he's made with Hiram. And so in return, Hiram sends some of his workmen. He sends these cedar logs, probably from cedars of Lebanon, up there nearby, come down and build this big palace for David. Okay, and David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children born to him there: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. Okay. So he's got, yeah, well, and he's got a bunch more wives, and he's got a bunch more. So there's two things going on here at once. On one hand, God's delivering on the promises he made to him when he was anointed king as that shepherd boy. On the other hand, he's becoming a king like the kings of the other nations. He's making friends with the kings of the other nations. He's marrying the daughters of the kings of the other nations. He's building himself a big palace. Okay. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him. But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me?" The Lord answered him, "Go, for I will surely hand the Philistines over to you." So David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, "As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me." So that place was called Baal Perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. Okay. Now, a couple issues here. Why is he naming a place after Baal? Right? Baal, Perazim, means Baal who breaks out. Right? As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me. So the place was called Baal Perazim. Okay. Secondly, when the Philistines left their idols there, why did the men take them instead of destroying them?
This says they buried them.
Which is that? Is that the
King James?
Okay. Yeah, the Greek original here says took. So that may be wishful thinking. That may be wishful thinking. Okay. However, Baal in particular and Asherah, these are in particular the gods of the Phoenicians, like Hiram, king of Tyre. Okay. So there's at the very least some cultural influence creeping in, if not with David himself, with his men, with some of the people around him, okay, with some of the culture of Israel. There's not, even under David now, there's not sort of this distinction that God wanted. Remember the whole idea in Deuteronomy that they were going to be different than all the other nations, and all the other nations would look at them and see how different they were and say, we want to be more like that, and so we're going to follow your God, right? There's not that clear difference, right? David's taken over, but he's not going out and purging Israel of all the idol worship. Those influences are still there and are even creeping in, with his wives and with his friends and with his... Verse 22, once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the balsam trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army. So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. Okay. So the Philistines have been pushed back somewhat definitively at this point, is the idea. They've been making trouble all this time. Right? David has, for the time being, put them out of the picture.
I don't understand. I mean, he's able to talk to God directly.
Yes.
Directly. Well, why doesn't God say, hey, you're doing this all wrong?
Well, we're going to see he does. Now, when he inquires of the Lord, that's nothing. Remember, we have to go back. We have to remember what we read back in Leviticus and Numbers, right? When someone inquires of the Lord, what do? They go to the priest, right, to seek the Lord's will. What do we do about this? And if it's something that's unclear, because the priests, of course, have the law. If it's something that's unclear, then they use the Urim and the Thummim. Remember, they sort of cast them like they're casting lots and decide, okay, this is what God wants you to do. So it's not that he's walking out on his balcony and saying, God, should I go smite the Philistines? And a voice is coming down from the sky and saying, yes, smite them. Right? It's this inquiring is this process that involves the priests and involves the prophets of the Lord.
I guess he doesn't necessarily have to use the human and human.
Well, I mean, we don't read specifically that he does that, but when it says so-and-so inquired of the Lord, that's referring back to that process of going and saying, and offerings and sacrifices that are offered at that time that we read about back in Leviticus and Numbers. So when we've seen in the past, the men of Judah inquired of the Lord. That's what it means. It means that they got the priest, they got the prophet when Samuel was there, who spoke for God. And we're going to see later on once David really messes up, God's going to send people to talk to him and tell him you're messing up, very clearly. So that's coming.
Oh, here it is. Back in first chapter. David seems able, the second chapter, verse 1 and 3, David seems able to inquire directly of the Lord, as no mention is made of ephod or other means of discernment, such as the Urim and the Thummim. The Lord instructs David to go to Ephod. He asks about where he should go. So, is he not doing this later on?
Well, it says the same thing there. I mean, it doesn't specifically say, it doesn't mention the Urim and Thummim every time. Like when the men of Judah were deciding whether to attack Benjamin at the end of Judges. It doesn't specifically say they used the Urim and the Thummim and all that. So I don't know that that's a necessary conclusion that just because that's not mentioned that that's not taking place. That he's not going through the process.
Well, he's
messing
So-
up.
He is. And we're going to see that God is going, like I
God's
said,
still
we're going to see that God's going to communicate that to him in no uncertain terms as it gets worse. Okay. Okay, so in the beginning of chapter 6, he's had this victory now where the Philistines have been pushed back, at least for the time being. Okay. Chapter 6, verse 1, David again brought together out of Israel chosen men, 30,000 in all. So he calls up an army. He and all his men set out from Baalah of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. Right, so here, this is kind of a weird construction. We're getting to the point where people are not wanting to say Yahweh out loud anymore. Okay, that's what that's referring to. They refer to the name. It's because, remember, we're not to take the name of the Lord, not to take the name of Yahweh in vain. Right, and so the idea was, well, if you never say it at all, then you can never take it in vain. Okay, so it's very common, and it become more and more common later on in Jewish practice all the way to today, that they don't say Yahweh, they just refer to it as the name, or Hashem, like when they're reading. They'll get to it, just say Hashem, the name, covering for. And this was standard, and this is part of what Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees, right? Because over time, people not understanding the purpose of the law and all those laws we read, right? They'll say, okay, I'm not supposed to work on Saturday, right? I'm not supposed to work on the Sabbath. What constitutes work? How far can I walk before it's work? Right? If my donkey falls in a ditch, can I pull my donkey out of the ditch, or is that work? Do I have to leave it in the ditch until Sunday and then pull it out of the ditch? Right? So people ask these questions, right? And so they start coming up with answers. They come up with this idea of building a hedge around the law, right? So they make these other rules to make sure that you never even get close to breaking the actual law, right? Like, so if you never say Yahweh, you can't say it in vain because you never say it, right? So they come up with all these rulings, and then they start to mistake all of these little rules for what God wants from them. Okay, and so the Pharisees, when Jesus comes along, are going to consider themselves righteous because they keep all these little rules, right? And Jesus is going to say, that's not what God wants. That's never been what God wanted from you. God's concerned about your heart, right? And so he calls them whitewashed tombs because on the outside, they're doing all the right things, but inside, they're dead, right? And so that's where that comes from. That's how we get there. It starts out with this kind of legalistic concern for the law, not understanding what Paul's going to call the letter of the law versus the spirit. The idea that, we need to, as long as we obey all these rules, then God will be happy with us, right? Instead of saying, these are here to show you, your own sinfulness when you break it, and to show you the kind of attitude, the kind of heart God expects you to have. But all through it, especially as we saw in Deuteronomy, he's saying, it's the circumcision that counts is the circumcision of the heart, right? Not circumcising your body, but your heart being softened. Right? But so we have a little taste of that here with the ark of God, which is called by the name, the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. Okay. So he goes down to bring it to his new capital city. Right? He sends men. So verse 3, they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. Okay? So Uzzah is sitting on the cart, Ahio is walking in front of the cart, leading probably the animal that's pulling the cart. Okay. Ahio and Uzzah here are two more good biblical names for any potential children that are sadly unused. Verse 5, David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord. That's celebrating with all their might. So they're really celebrating, right? This is if you want a proof text for feasts and having a good time, right? This is it. They're celebrating with all their might. Okay? Because when God has given us good things, that is something we should celebrate. Right? We tend to have the idea that we're supposed to walk around frowning all the time and fasting, and right? That's not the picture of how God wants us to live our lives. So they're celebrating with all their might, with songs and with harps, lyres, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. Okay, so they're hauling it in on the cart. The ox kind of stumbles, trips, right? So probably the ark wobbles back and forth a little on the cart. So Uzzah reaches back to grab it. Right? To grab it and settle it. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down and he died there beside the ark of God. So Uzzah drops dead.
I don't understand.
That seems kind of harsh. Again, right?
He touched it.
You're not allowed to touch it. No.
Just trying to.
It's like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Nazis. No. The idea here is, remember, we've got to think back. We've got to think back. When was the last time? Was it 1 Samuel that we saw the ark on an ox cart? Right, the Philistines had taken it. Everywhere the Philistines took it, the people in the city started getting tumors. So they finally said, we got to get rid of this thing. So they put it on an ox cart with no people. Remember? They just put it on an ox cart, attached an ox to it, and let it go. And the ox brought it back to Israel. Okay? And remember, part of what God was trying to show them, the reason they lost it in the first place, is that they lost a battle to the Philistines. They're like, oh man, we lost. We're going to fight them again. Hey, let's bring the ark, then we'll win. Right? Like, if we bring God with us, then we'll have to win. Right? This kind of idle thinking. Right? So they went out there with God, and guess what? They still lost, and the Philistines took the ark. Okay? So the idea here is that God is the one who's in control. Okay? So God could send the ark back with no people, just guiding the ox. Okay? So the reason that Uzzah doing this is irreverent is not that he touched it and he's not allowed to touch it. It's that he thought he had to keep it on the cart. Right? That he's the one in control. He's the one bringing it to Jerusalem. Right. Well, the idea was they should have trusted God. Again, if God can have the ox, God can take care of it, right? God's the one who, right? They're still treating this as sort of a magic object. Right? So, poor Uzzah, pays the price for it. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah. And to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah, which means outbreak against Uzzah. So that's forever known as the place where Uzzah got smacked down, right? David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? Okay? So now he kind of second guesses his plan. Right? He's like, I was going to bring the ark into my new capital. He's like, now I don't know. Now after this whole thing with Uzzah, right? He's a little worried. He's a little more circumspect. He's thinking about it more. Right? Well, what does that say about his original intent? Right? I've got my shiny new capital. I've got my shiny new palace. Now I'm going to bring God's ark into it. Now he's going, So verse 10, he was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Okay? So, he has them stop where it is, right? He says, well, they're near this guy's house. Now, Obed-Edom, remember, who's Obed? Ruth's son. Ruth's son, his grandfather. Okay, so this is a relative. This is a cousin, right, is the idea here. So he says, well, let's just leave it at my cousin's house down there for a little while, right? So they leave it there for 3 months, and for those 3 months that it's there, he's blessed, everything goes great. Okay, so verse 12, now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went down and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. So everything goes okay there. So he's like, okay, I'll bring it into I'll bring it into Jerusalem now. Okay? So he brings it in. There's much rejoicing, more celebrating with all their might. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. Okay? So more, now he's dancing with all his might. Okay? So they're going at it, they're celebrating, they're having a good time. Because the ark of the Lord is coming into Jerusalem. Everyone's happy, except in verse 16, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. So she's not happy, right? Seeing him dance around with all his might in his little linen outfit. She's upset. So verse 17, they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. Okay? So they have all the sacrifices. They've got a tabernacle set up there for it. They have all the sacrifices. They all get some food. Right? And they all go home. Everybody's happy. But, verse 20, when David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would. Your translation may have something different than vulgar fellow. But the idea is, you're supposed to be the king. What are you doing dancing around? What are you doing dancing around like an idiot, in public? Carrying on like this. Right, you're not even wearing your proper, you're just wearing this linen under outfit, right? Verse 21, David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. That's kind of a slap. Right? It's kind of a slap to her. Remember, he took her back. Right? She was out. But I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Okay. So this is the passage. If you're ever really celebrating on Easter, somebody tries to tell you to stop, this is the text to point them to show them that they'll be accursed.
More than this.
Yeah. But that's not really what's wrong. But there is, interestingly, among the apostolic canons, I think I mentioned this before in another context back in Deuteronomy, Amongst the apostolic canons and the canons of the church are approved at the Council of Nicaea, the First Ecumenical Council, there's a canon that says that anyone who, on a feast day, and especially on Easter, refuses to drink alcohol, eat meat, or sleep with his wife is anathema. Okay. So technically you can be excommunicated from the church for refusing to celebrate. And that's something of what's being gotten at here. That's something of what's being gotten at here. Okay? The idea that the good things the Lord gives us, He gives us to be enjoyed, for us to be thankful for us to celebrate. When we have feast days in the church, those are actually supposed to be feast days, right? That we enjoy and we celebrate. It's not just supposed to be an extra time we have to go to church, and so I wanted to watch the game, right? The idea is we're supposed to be celebrating, right? These are supposed to be joyous occasions. God wants us to have these joyous occasions and celebrate together as a church and as family. These are good things. Right? These are good things that God has given. They can be abused, right? And there's a time for feasting and there's a time for fasting, right? But there is a time for feasting. There is a time for just joy and celebration and enjoying one another, enjoying the good things that God has created. Okay? And that's part of what this is about. That David, is so happy about the ark of the Lord coming and the tabernacle that he doesn't care who thinks he's undignified and who thinks, what other people think of him. He's going to celebrate. Right? He's going to celebrate. Okay? It's a much more positive note to leave off on tonight than 2 weeks ago. So I think I will leave off on that positive. Well, not positive for Michael, really, but positive for us in our lives. So that takes us through the end of chapter 6. We're not going to have Bible study next week. Next week we're going to have Vespers over at St. John's in Kanawha City. Yeah. And but 2 weeks from tonight we will have class. Okay. And we'll pick up and we'll probably go about through chapter 12, I would guess, 12 or 13. And after that class, there's going to be a little bit of a break. Because the Sunday after that, we're having Vespers at Beckley. And then the week after that is Palm Sunday. And then the week it's coming up real quick. The week after that is Easter. So there's going to be a little bit of a break after that class before we come back. But 2 weeks from now will be the next class before that break. So thank you, everybody.